Okay, so you want to own a diamond mine. You picture the postcard version immediately. A hole in the ground somewhere remote and dramatic. A conveyor belt shaking loose a fortune. A velvet tray of rough stones catching the light. You think of diamonds the way you think of gold. A fixed, universally desired thing. And you assume that if you can just get the rock out of the ground, the rest takes care of itself. Dig it up, sell it, get rich. Here's the problem. A diamond mine is one of the strangest businesses on earth, because unlike almost anything else pulled out of the ground, the value of what you're digging up was never really set by supply and demand alone. For most of the last century, it was set on purpose, by design, by an industry that built its entire fortune on convincing the world that a common mineral was rare. And the moment you understand that, everything else about this business, why it costs what it costs, why mines that produced for decades can go bankrupt twice, and why the ground beneath this entire industry has been shifting under everyone's feet for the last 5 years, starts to make sense. Let's start with what you're actually buying into, because not all diamond mines are the same business. The first category is kimberlite pipe mining, the industrial version most people picture. Diamonds form under enormous heat and pressure, roughly 100 miles beneath the Earth's surface, and they only reach the surface at all because of ancient volcanic eruptions that punched narrow carrot-shaped columns of rock called kimberlite pipes up through the crust. Find one of these pipes, and you found the delivery mechanism nature used to bring diamonds up from the mantle. This is the category that built companies like Beers, Rio Tinto, and Alrosa, and it requires enormous fixed infrastructure, open pits or underground shafts, processing plants, tailings dams, the works. The second category is alluvial mining, digging through riverbeds, floodplains, and old coastlines where diamonds eroded out of kimberlite pipes millions of years ago and were washed downstream and concentrated by moving water. This is dramatically cheaper to start, sometimes little more than sieves, water and shovels, which is exactly why it's the entry point for small-scale and artisanal miners across parts of West and Central Africa. The third category is marine diamond mining, which sounds almost like science fiction. Off the coast of Namibia, specialized vessels drag enormous drill and airlift systems across the seabed, vacuuming up diamond-bearing gravel from ancient river deltas now sitting under the Atlantic. These ships can cost hundreds of millions of dollars each, and the company that pioneered this approach now pulls the majority of Namibia's diamonds by value from beneath the ocean floor rather than from any hole in the ground at all. And then there's a fourth category that didn't exist in any meaningful way a decade ago and has since become the single biggest threat to everything else on this list: laboratory-grown diamonds, chemically identical stones grown in machines rather than mined from the earth. We'll come back to that one, because it is currently in the process of rewriting this entire industry's economics in real time. Each of these is a fundamentally different bet, and the bet starts with the single riskiest number in the entire business. Before you spend $1 building anything, you have to find a deposit worth building on, and the odds of that are almost comically bad. Diamond exploration means searching for kimberlite pipes, and geologists estimate that only around 1% of the kimberlite pipes discovered anywhere in the world actually contain diamonds in economic concentrations. In one of the most productive diamond districts on the planet, Canada's Lac de Gras region in the Northwest Territories, roughly 5% of all kimberlites discovered there turned out to host an economic deposit, and that 5% was considered an exceptional hit rate by the standards of this industry. Most exploration companies spend years, sometimes decades, and tens of millions of dollars drilling, sampling, and testing kimberlite after kimberlite before finding a single one worth building a mine around. And even after you find one, you're not done. You need what's called a bulk sample, extracting thousands of tons of ore specifically to count how many carats of diamonds come out of it, because unlike gold or copper, you cannot assay a diamond deposit with a chemical test. You have to physically process enormous volumes of rock and count actual stones. A single bulk sampling program on a promising pipe can easily run tens of millions of dollars, and it might still come back showing the diamonds are too small, too low quality, or too sparse to justify a mine. This is the first lesson of diamond economics. You are not paying for the right to mine a known resource. You are paying over years for the privilege of finding out whether one exists at all. Say the odds break your way, and you've got a deposit worth building. Now comes the capital, and this is where the fantasy usually collapses. A major kimberlite mine is not a modest undertaking. Canada's Diavik mine, built on an island in a remote Arctic lake in the Northwest Territories, cost approximately 1.3 billion Canadian dollars to construct between 2000 and 2003, and that number is before you account for the underground expansion that came years later, which required several $100 million more just to keep the mine alive once the open pit ran out. Quebec's Renard mine, the first diamond mine ever built in that province, required a financing package of roughly 946 million Canadian dollars just to get to production. These are not unusual figures in this industry. They are close to the baseline, and a huge portion of that money doesn't go toward digging at all. It goes towards simply existing in a location that has no roads, no power grid, and no way to bring in a bulldozer. Diavik sits so far into the Arctic that for most of the year, the only way to move heavy equipment and fuel to the site is a seasonal ice road, a temporary highway built across frozen lakes that only exists for about 2 months a year and can only carry trucks once the ice reaches sufficient thickness to bear their weight. Building and maintaining that road across roughly 400 kilometers of frozen lakes costs on the order of $15 to $20 million annually, shared between the mining companies that depend on it. And if a warm winter delays the freeze, or an early thaw shortens the season, mines can miss their entire annual delivery window for fuel and heavy machinery. Miss that window, and a diamond mine can find itself flying in diesel fuel by aircraft at a cost many multiples higher than trucking it in, just to keep the generators running through the winter. Once the infrastructure exists, you still have to process an almost absurd volume of rock to find a genuinely small volume of diamonds. Ore grade in this industry is measured in carats per ton, and even an excellent high-grade deposit typically yields somewhere between 2 and 4 carats of diamonds per ton of kimberlite processed. A carat, remember, is a fifth of a gram, so a mine can crush, wash, and screen an entire ton of solid rock, more than 2,000 pounds of it, and recover something in the range of half a gram to a gram of diamond in total. This is why the processing plant, not the pit itself, tends to be one of the most capital-intensive parts of the whole operation. Massive crushers break the ore down. Dense media separation tanks exploit the fact that diamonds are heavier than the surrounding rock. X-ray fluorescence sorters flash rock past sensors that can detect a diamond's particular way of glowing, and the entire system runs continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because idle processing capacity on a mine this expensive to build is capacity you paid for and aren't using. On top of that, the leftover crushed rock, the tailings, has to go somewhere, and in the Arctic and subarctic locations that host many of the world's kimberlite mines, that means building engineered containment structures capable of holding back millions of tons of processed rock for decades, sometimes centuries, after the mine itself has closed. Now here's the part of this business that separates it from almost every other extractive industry on the planet, and it's the part that actually explains why this whole thing has been so unusually profitable for so long. If you mine gold, or copper, or oil, you are selling into a genuine commodity market. Every ounce of gold is essentially interchangeable with every other ounce of gold. The price is set on an open exchange, visible to everyone, updating by the second. Diamonds do not work this way, and they were deliberately built not to work this way. For most of the 20th century, the diamond industry was dominated by a single company, De Beers, which at its peak controlled somewhere around 80 to 90% of the world's rough diamond supply through an organization called the Central Selling Organization. The company didn't just mine diamonds. It bought up production from other miners around the world specifically to control how much rough material reached the market in any given year, holding back supply during weak periods and releasing it during strong ones, managing global diamond prices the way a central bank manages a currency. This wasn't a side effect of being a big company. It was the entire strategy. A diamond is, chemically, just crystallized carbon. What makes it valuable is scarcity, and for most of the last century, that scarcity was substantially manufactured rather than discovered. De Beers reinforced this with one of the most successful advertising campaigns in commercial history, the idea that a diamond is forever, launched specifically to discourage people from reselling diamonds on a secondary market, because a healthy resale market would have exposed how much supply was actually sitting in drawers and safety deposit boxes around the world. This system still echoes through how rough diamonds get sold today, even though De Beers' market share has fallen substantially since the days of the Central Selling Organization, down to roughly a third of global supply, with Russia's Alrosa, Botswana's State Mining Company, and independent operators picking up the rest. De Beers still sells rough diamonds through a process called a site, held roughly 10 times a year, where a select list of pre-approved buyers called site holders, historically somewhere around 80 to 90 companies worldwide, are shown a sealed box of rough stones at a fixed price, and given a choice: take the whole box at the price offered, or don't buy from De Beers at all. That cycle. There is no haggling. This is not an auction. It is closer to a private allocation system than a marketplace, and it exists specifically because a diamond is not a fungible commodity like a barrel of oil. Every rough stone is unique in size, shape, color, and internal clarity, which means the entire industry runs on skilled sorters and graders who spend their careers learning to classify stones according to the 4 C's: carat weight, cut potential, color, and clarity, before a single stone is ever sold. You cannot simply post a spot price for diamonds the way you can for gold, because no two are quite the same thing. To understand what happens when that carefully constructed scarcity collides with the ordinary economics of mining, you don't need a theory. You need to look at what happened to Rio Tinto's Argyle mine in Western Australia. For 37 years, Argyle was one of the largest diamond mines on the planet by volume, at its peak in 1994, producing 42.8 million carats in a single year, and across its entire operating life, it pulled more than 865 million carats of rough diamond out of the East Kimberley region. It was also the source of something no other mine on Earth could reliably supply: natural pink, red, and violet-colored diamonds, gems so rare that a single Argyle pink stone weighing under 15 carats sold at auction for over $71 million. And yet, on the 3rd of November 2020, Argyle closed permanently, not because the diamonds ran out entirely, but because the economics stopped working. As the pit deepened over nearly 4 decades, the cost of extracting each additional ton of ore kept climbing, while the average value of what came out of the ground stayed largely flat. Here's the detail that surprises people. Only around 5% of everything Argyle ever mined was gem quality. The other 95% was industrial-grade material, useful mostly as an abrasive or in drill bits, sold for a fraction of gem prices. That small 5% sliver, the pink diamonds and colored gems the mine was famous for, generated the overwhelming majority of its profit in the years it was still profitable at all. When rising costs met a mine whose average price per carat was already thin, there was no scarcity story large enough to save it. Rio Tinto closed the gates and began a rehabilitation process expected to take the better part of a decade. If Argyle shows you what happens when a mine's costs finally outrun its ore, Stornoway Diamond Corporation shows you what happens when the market itself turns against you. Twice. Stornoway built the Renard mine in Quebec, the first diamond mine ever constructed in that province, financed through a package of roughly 946 million Canadian dollars, one of the largest single project financings in Canadian diamond mining history. The mine opened in 2016 and 2017, with a projected average selling price of around $147 per carat. By the second quarter of 2019, the actual average price realized was $76 per carat, roughly half of what the entire financing model had assumed, driven by a rough diamond market correction centered on India, where the vast majority of the world's rough stones are cut and polished. India's diamond manufacturers were dealing with a weakening currency, tight credit, and a glut of unsold polished inventory, and when that midstream slowdown hit, it rippled straight back up the supply chain to a remote mine in northern Quebec that had borrowed nearly $1 billion against a price forecast that no longer existed. Stornoway filed for creditor protection in September of 2019, restructured, and survived. Then, in October of 2023, it filed again. Its second bankruptcy in 4 years, after the price it was actually achieving on its diamonds fell to roughly $81.50 per carat, against a budgeted $120, compounded by a fresh Indian import moratorium and lost production from forest fires. The mine went into care and maintenance, its workforce cut from around 530 people down to 71, 2 bankruptcies in 4 years, at a mine that had already proven it could pull diamonds economically out of the ground. The rock never stopped being valuable in principle. What kept failing was the price the rest of the world was willing to pay for it in any given 18-month window, a number the mine itself had absolutely no control over. Which brings us to the disruption currently tearing through this entire industry, and it is happening right now, not as a historical case study, but as an active, ongoing collapse. Laboratory-grown diamonds, grown in machines using high pressure and high temperature or chemical vapor deposition, are chemically, optically, and structurally identical to mined diamonds, certified by the same gemological laboratories using the same 4 Cs. In 2019, lab-grown stones accounted for roughly 5% of diamond jewelry sales. By 2024, they had captured somewhere around 45% of American engagement ring purchases by volume. The price collapse behind that shift has been brutal. Wholesale prices for lab-grown diamonds fell by roughly 74% between 2020 and 2024, driven by a more than 300% expansion in global production capacity, largely from manufacturers in India entering the market at industrial scale. A natural 1-carat diamond that might have sold for around $6,000 in 2021 was averaging closer to $4,200 by 2025. A comparable lab-grown 1-carat stone can now be bought for somewhere between $750 and $1,000. No company has felt this more directly than De Beers itself, the very company that spent a century manufacturing the idea that a diamond's rarity was permanent. Anglo-American, which owns roughly 85% of De Beers, has taken repeated multi-billion-dollar impairments against the business, totaling close to $7 billion in write-downs across recent years, as natural diamond prices kept falling, and demand for smaller, lower-quality stones weakened sharply. De Beers built up roughly $2 billion in unsold natural rough inventory, announced production cuts of more than 10%, and cut thousands of jobs. Botswana's State Diamond Company cut its own output by as much as 40% to match the collapse in demand. Russia's Alrosa saw profits fall by close to 80% and suspended operations at some of its own sites. And Anglo-American has moved to divest De Beers entirely, a business built specifically to control the supply and price of an object it once convinced the entire world could never lose its value. The industry's own response has been to lean even harder into the story that started this whole business in the first place, positioning natural stones as a rare, provenance-backed luxury item precisely because they can no longer compete on price or, in most cases, on appearance. This is the mechanism you need to understand if you're thinking about owning a mine today. For most of this industry's history, the revenue side of a diamond mine's economics was protected by an artificial scarcity that a small number of large players actively managed. That protection has been eroding for years, and the arrival of a chemically identical substitute that costs a fraction of the price has done to natural diamonds roughly what streaming did to movie theaters, except faster, and with no equivalent of the theatrical window to slow it down. A lab-grown stone doesn't have to wait 90 days or negotiate an exclusivity clause. It sits next to the natural stone in the same display case on day one, certified by the same lab, at a fifth of the price. Let's put a real mine's annual economics together, using figures consistent with a mid-size established kimberlite operation. Say the mine processes 3 million tons of ore in a year, at an average grade of 2.5 carats per ton, yielding roughly 7.5 million carats of rough diamond, at a blended average realized price of $90 per carat, reasonably representative of where the broader market has landed, as low-quality and small stones have been hit hardest by lab-grown competition. That's approximately $675 million in annual rough diamond revenue. Now the costs. All-in sustaining costs at a well-run, low-cost operation can run somewhere around $60 to $90 per carat, covering mining, processing, remote logistics, camp operations, and sustaining capital. At the higher end of that range, say $85 per carat, the operating cost on 7.5 million carats comes to roughly $638 million. That leaves an operating margin of only about $37 million on $675 million of revenue, before accounting for the depreciation of a mine that likely cost well over $1 billion to build, before debt service on that construction financing, and before a single dollar of exploration spending to find whatever comes next once this deposit runs out. Shift the average realized price down by just $15 a carat, roughly the kind of swing store Naue experienced in a single 18-month stretch, and that $37 million margin turns into a loss of more than $75 million in the same year, with the exact same ore in the ground, the exact same mine, the exact same workforce. Nothing about the rock changed, only the price the rest of the world was willing to pay for it. The mines that have survived this cycle share a few identifiable traits. They control the entire value chain, rather than just the hole in the ground, capturing margin at the cutting and polishing stage rather than selling only rough material at wholesale. They lean into what a machine genuinely cannot replicate, natural rarity with verified provenance, and, where they're lucky enough to have it, color. Colored diamonds, the pinks, blues, and reds that made Argyle famous, remain in a different market entirely from ordinary white stones, because a lab can grow a flawless colorless diamond relatively easily, but still cannot reliably replicate the specific combination of trace elements and structural distortion that produces a natural fancy-colored stone at scale, and Argyle's final tender sales in 2020 and 2021 for tiny lots of pink and violet diamonds continued to draw extraordinary prices, even as the broader natural diamond market weakened around them. And the survivors diversify their revenue away from a single mine's fortunes entirely, spreading risk across multiple deposits and multiple countries so that one bad price cycle in one location doesn't take down the whole company the way it took down Stornoway twice from a single asset. So does owning a diamond mine actually work as a business? The honest answer depends entirely on which era you're asking about. In the optimistic version, and this was essentially the entire 20th century, you own a productive kimberlite pipe. A small number of large players manage global supply carefully enough to keep prices stable and climbing, and a mine that cost over $1 billion to build can run profitably for decades, occasionally producing a once-in-a-generation colored stone that alone can cover a full year of overhead. In the realistic version, the one this industry is actually living through right now, you own a mine that cost over $1 billion to build, sitting somewhere with no roads and no power grid, dependent on a 2-month ice road that a warm winter can simply take away from you, competing not against other mines but against a laboratory that can produce a chemically identical stone at a fifth of the price, in an industry whose largest company is being written down by billions of dollars by its own parent, precisely because the scarcity story that justified those prices for 100 years has finally met a rival it cannot outmarket. The rock in the ground never changes. What changes, faster now than at any point in this industry's history, is whether anyone still believes it has to be rare to be worth wanting at all.